As a preemptive warning, today's episode discusses suicidal ideation, violence, and PTSD, topics that can be upsetting or disturbing for some listeners. Trauma is a distressing fact in many of our lives. From the little things that add up to major life-altering events, an unfortunate amount of people have endured some kind of trauma, and these traumatic events can leave lasting impressions on our minds. It can disrupt lives, rob people of their sense of security and safety, and it could lead to a life where many people face long-term mental health struggles. Thankfully, trauma research has come a very long way in a short amount of time. There are researchers out there who are looking at the ways people experience trauma, from PTSD to violence at the hands of someone close to them. And these researchers are finding ways to address these lasting problems not just more quickly, but more effectively, giving survivors better mental health outcomes and hopefully more positive and fruitful days ahead. I'm Amanda DeJong, and you're listening to Now at Ohio State. We talk with researchers, innovators, and bold thinkers who look at our world, see what the real challenges are, and create the solutions that people need now. Craig Bryan is a doctor and researcher at Ohio State. His experience is in cognitive behavioral treatments for those experiencing suicidal thoughts and PTSD. He sits down with our Chris Booker to talk about the ways civilians initially helped the military treat and care for troops with PTSD, and how research from the military is now helping civilians recover faster too.
Dr. Bryan, thanks for joining us today. What are some of the signs we should be looking for ourselves or for loved ones to recognize PTSD and recognize when it needs treatment?
What we're learning now is there are different sort of types of PTSD, and types meaning they can sometimes be experienced in different ways. I think the idea that most people have in mind is more of like the fear and the anxiety, the person who's like afraid of dangerous situations. They jump at loud noises, things like that. And that's one aspect of PTSD. But there's some others that manifest more as like guilt or shame, where people regret what they've done, or they feel bad maybe about a decision they made, or sometimes a decision that they did not make that they believe they should have. Having said that, I think other things to be looking for that are sort of hallmark indicators of PTSD are people having what's called re-experiencing symptoms. So this is dreams, nightmares of that event, of that trauma, having unwanted memories. And in key, it's not just like a bad memory. We all have bad memories, right? But it's experienced in a very intrusive way where the person feels like they don't have any control over the memories themselves. And then the last thing to look for is, because of these sort of re-experiencing symptoms and these uncomfortable emotions, people avoid. So they stay away from situations and places and people that remind them of that traumatic experience. So they stop going to public spaces, they don't go to the grocery store, they don't go to crowded concerts, things like that. But they might also avoid certain topics of conversation, certain kind of things that are on TV. And those, I think, are probably some of the most reliable indicators of PTSD that distinguish PTSD from maybe other types of mental health conditions like anxiety or depression that often kind of look the same or sometimes go hand in hand with PTSD.
One of the other things that we discussed earlier on was your approach to treating PTSD and the treatment programs for PTSD. Talk to me a little bit about that, if you would, and then how your therapies relate to the civilian population and that kind of workflow.
When we think of post-traumatic stress disorder or PTSD, a very specific type of mental health problem, there's, I think, still a widespread assumption within society that this is a chronic, unending problem. There's not much we can do. You're always going to be traumatized. You're always, going to suffer the consequences of trauma. And the good news is that that's not true for most people. We actually have really good treatments now that help the majority of people who struggle with PTSD. And those treatments are a handful of psychotherapies. The best results so far come from particular types of psychotherapies that are classified as trauma therapies. They focus on the PTSD itself. And what we've seen is that those trauma therapies, which were initially developed in civilian settings, so they were, in some cases, one of the treatments, for example, was largely developed working with women who had experienced sexual assault. Another treatment was developed a little bit more focused on people who had experienced like life-threatening injuries, motor vehicle accidents, things like that. And then over time, these therapies developed with civilians were then sort of transported into the military. And many of us who served in the military started using the treatments. And, my sort of involvement in this progression of research was related to when I was deployed to Iraq in 2009 and treating service members downrange for these traumatic exposures, blasts, people dying, exposure to kind of horrors. But we didn't have the luxury of scheduling an hour of therapy a week for weeks on end. You had to be very fast. People needed to either return to the battlefield or they had to go home to the U.S. And what we found was that we could compress these therapies into very short windows of time where we can meet with people every day or multiple times per day. And instead of doing, say, like 10 or 12 therapy sessions over a few months, we would do as many therapy sessions as we could in like 3 or 4 days. And it was working. And so we then brought it back to the U.S. and we started continuing this work with military personnel and veterans. And our team here at OSU, part of why we moved to OSU is we wanted to start broadening the window to start working with civilians. And so we've been doing research here using this massed compressed therapy format with civilians. And it works. It works really well. And so it's kind of this interesting sort of coming full circle of a treatment developed in the civilian setting was then adapted for use with military personnel and veterans, and we kind of manipulated it and changed it. And now we're bringing it back to civilians, and it becomes a sort of feedback loop of learning from our past experiences to constantly get better, to improve things, to be able to help people in ways that we weren't able to before.
If you would explain mass therapy, Dr. Bryan, and why does it matter?
The traditional way to do therapy is, you schedule maybe a 1-hour session with your therapist every week, once a week, for weeks, months, sometimes for years. And what we do with mass therapy is we keep that 1-hour therapy session, but we oftentimes do it every single day, maybe twice a day during a 1 to 2 week window. So you kind of take the full dose of treatment and collapse it into a really, really short period of time. And so the people who come and participate in mass therapy, some actually come to Columbus, they'll stay in a hotel, or if they're local, they'll just come to our office every day, but we also do telehealth. And so we just do 1-hour appointments where we do these therapies Monday through Friday. And what we find is that we actually get slightly better results in treating PTSD. Upwards of about 70% of people who go through these massed therapies no longer have PTSD at the end of this 2-week period of time. And we think there's a couple reasons for that, one of which is people are more likely to finish the therapy. When you only have to devote 2 weeks of your life to treatment and focus, whereas sometimes going once a week for months or years, you have schedule conflicts, other things come up, and people are more likely to not complete the therapy. So we think the masked format works because it gets people everything they need in a much higher dose. But secondly, I think there's something to be said about those who seek out masked therapy. And I think there's a commitment, right, to recovery, to say, I'm going to focus on this for 2 weeks. And this is going to be a prominent part of my life for a short period of time. And I think that resolve and that dedication, helps to push people through the therapy, to keep them going, to help them to fully engage in the recovery process, which I think pays dividends long term. And what we're seeing now in our research, we follow up with people 1-2 years after the therapy, and most of them are still doing really well. So it's pretty effective and it's long lasting.
Dr. Bryan, thank you for sharing this great information.
Juliana Nemeth is also making huge strides in understanding trauma, specifically its link to physical violence and brain injury. As an assistant professor, her research at Ohio State is dedicated to improving health and reducing health disparities for those impacted by violence and trauma. From her work in the field to her current research efforts, Juliana has a very unique and very poignant view into the worlds of injury and trauma. She sits down with our Misty Crane to discuss the link between trauma, violence, and brain injury. She also discusses how her findings are helping victims get more holistic and beneficial treatments.
Thanks for joining us today, Juliana.
Thank you so much for having me here.
So, Juliana, your work in partnership with the Ohio Domestic Violence Network has been instrumental in identifying the prevalence of brain injury among people who have survived violence at the hands of their partners. How did you begin your work in this area?
I'm a researcher now, and I work for Ohio State, but the reality is I worked in community practice directly serving survivors of domestic violence and sexual assault for over 10 years in direct service in providing court-based advocacy and responding to hospital settings where survivors were seeking emergency medical services, and in working in community settings where survivors are accessing school and social services and community services of all kinds. I was running suicide prevention coalitions in the communities that I worked as well, and I was seeing the link between suicide and survivors of child sexual abuse and domestic violence and other things were taking their own lives at higher rates. And I was just very concerned that we were missing something for survivors, that there was health justice that was needed, and that we really needed research to support better understanding how to work with survivors to meet their health needs and to reduce the health disparities that so many survivors experience.
Could you tell us a bit about what helped you make the connection between domestic violence and brain injury, and what it was like to learn how common it actually was?
The Ohio Domestic Violence Network received a federal grant to work with local domestic violence service organizations to better accommodate the needs of survivors coming into service with mental health issues and brain injury. Most domestic violence service organizations and other organizations working with survivors have adopted trauma-informed care practices in the last 20 years. And those trauma-informed care practices, they really recognize that survivors are dealing with psychological trauma, but what happened is we've missed a brain injury as causing neurologic trauma. So in the grant that Ohio Domestic Violence Network received, we actually went out to do needs assessment with the staff that work at DV programs as well as with the survivors served by those programs. And what we learned in our first interviews was that over 8 in 10 of the survivors seeking services in our state were coming in with unmet need regarding brain injury from either blunt force head trauma or strangulation. Both those things can cause brain injury. But the staff that worked at the programs had no clue that survivors were struggling with brain injury. And quite honestly, having worked with struggling survivors for years in community settings, I felt almost embarrassed having missed brain injury. And once you realize that, brain injury could be affecting survivors' ability to access services, their ability to remember things, the physical problems that they're having that can have impacts on them for years after the abuse has stopped, when you realize, oh my gosh, we've discovered a missing piece and we really need to do something about this. So.
Now, prior to your research, most people thought of two groups of people when they thought about brain injury: military personnel and athletes, especially football players. Why is it important for caregivers and others to consider brain injury when they're treating and working with domestic violence survivors as well?
Brain injury can impact people's cognitive ability. It impacts their emotional functioning. It impacts a lot of physical things as well. And if we're not recognizing that brain injury is impacting the survivor in front of us, we're not able to provide accommodations for our services. And the reality is a lot of survivors seek services in places that aren't domestic violence programs. They come into health facilities, they are in social services, they are in community settings, and they're seeking help for a variety of things. And if we don't recognize that the survivor in front of me could be dealing with a brain injury, we actually aren't putting in place accommodations to meet their needs so they can access the services that they're there for. I think it is a matter of safety and of life and death sometimes for survivors, but it also is about quality of life and moving forward and recovery and healing as well. So it's really important to recognize that many survivors are living with brain injuries that are not being addressed or identified.
You're touching a bit on what I was going to ask about next, which is if there are examples you could share of what goes wrong when brain injury isn't on the table, when you're just considering trauma in the absence of brain injury.
When I worked at the Columbus City Prosecutor's Office, domestic violence survivors needed to come down to the courthouse to access safety or protection orders if they wanted those. And the reality is, if you've just been concussed or just experienced a brain injury from violence, we are then asking people who maybe are really disoriented to place and time to figure out how to get down to the courthouse, where to have their children go, how to make it into the courthouse where there could be overhead lighting and where there could be lots of loud noises, to actually ask for an order of protection. And oftentimes we found that survivors didn't show up for that. And oftentimes we assumed it's because they didn't want to participate in the system. But the reality is maybe they couldn't. Maybe they had an injury that really led to their inability to do the things that they needed to do to navigate to get down to the courthouse. Survivors are dealing with so much, but if we don't recognize that they have a brain injury from the violence that is going unaddressed in all these service systems, many survivors struggle with suicidal ideation and substance use and mental health issues and a variety of health conditions that we oftentimes never even associate with violence. But the reality is brain injury is a risk factor for inflammation and a lot of different kinds of both behavioral risk factors as well as other kinds of diseases. And so this is huge. If we don't address that survivors are living with brain injuries that are not being addressed, the reality is they could lead lives where they're suffering for a very long time.
So your research also led to the development of an evidence-based toolkit for healthcare providers and other community partners. Can you talk a bit about the CARE framework and free resources and how they're supporting those who work with survivors?
Absolutely. It actually improves the ability of staff members to provide trauma-informed care in general because they're actually addressing brain injury. And that helps them to reinterpret behavior that they're seeing in front of them and offer accommodations and referrals to support survivors. CARE itself stands for Connecting Authentically with Survivors, acknowledging that brain injury is oftentimes a result of direct hits to the head or being held in a way that you can't breathe, and that brain injury can affect global functioning and it can affect how people feel, what they're thinking, their physical abilities and ways to move forward. And then it's about responding to what it is that we hear survivors saying as their needs really moving forward. And there's a bunch of CARE tools that are resources that help staff members identify the mental health and the brain injury needs of survivors, as well as tools for setting up accommodations within service systems to better meet the needs of survivors living with brain injury. And then the E just stands for evaluate. It's really important to come back to survivors and make sure that what it is that we've done, the accommodations that we've put in place and the referrals that we've made are accessible for survivors. In the end, CARE just helps people do their jobs better wherever they are and whatever it is that the client is coming in to seek services for. The reality is violence against women and vulnerable populations is extraordinarily widespread, and survivors are accessing services all different places. So if providers start with a trauma-informed approach that's brain injury aware to meeting the needs of their clients, oftentimes the CARE framework gives them the tools to identify that brain injury might be an issue here and to put in place accommodations so people can access services.
Can you talk a little bit more about the other populations who could be helped by the CARE model?
Here locally, I was also funded to do research with youth and young adults experiencing homelessness. And my work with the Ohio Domestic Violence Network made me start to ask questions of the youth here in the central Ohio area. And we've also discovered that a majority of the youth here are actually walking around with undiagnosed brain injuries, not just from intimate partner violence, but from other sources of violence. And that really made us realize this is an issue that's actually affecting lots of different populations who are targeted for violence at higher rates, and that it's really a common issue that really needs to be addressed across multiple service settings. A lot of survivors of violence are seeking services, and although we're providing trauma-informed care, we're not providing brain injury-aware trauma-informed care. So the care model could really be applied for use in those kind of settings, any kind of health setting. People who are pregnant are more likely to experience violence during pregnancy and strangulation and blunt force head trauma that lead to brain injury. We know that the person's affected, but the child is probably also affected. So working with new moms and new families and communities in supporting children. And in our schools, it's kind of a ripple effect. The reality is violence, interpersonal violence, child abuse, sexual abuse, domestic violence, community violence is pervasive in some places. And the head and the airways are the most likely target of that violence.
One last thing, for those who might want to take a look, I know that you and the Ohio Domestic Violence Network have made a point of making the care materials free and available to anyone and everyone. How do people go about finding those and using those?
Yeah. The Ohio Domestic Violence Network developed the Center on Partner-Inflicted Brain Injury as a result of our work, and they have a website now that has phenomenal resources for survivors directly, for service providers who are looking to implement care, and the care tools are all on their website and free for download. And people can access that at www.odvn.org.
Well, thanks so much for coming in today, Juliana. It's really been great talking to you.
Thank you so much for having me in to talk about this very important issue.
It takes a certain kind of person to wake up every day, battling their own traumas, but still striving to improve the lives of others. To be so inspired by their own struggles that they dedicate their lives to researching better treatments, better care for those in need. And since trauma is so universal, so ubiquitous to all of us, their work truly does change countless lives. To think that the work of researchers like Brian and Juliana can literally resonate with almost every human. It's the sheer definition of turning a negative into a truly profound, truly impactful positive. Now at Ohio State is produced by The Ohio State University's Office of Marketing and Communications. For more information, visit us at go.osu.edu/now. I'm your host, Amanda DeJong. Thanks for listening, and we'll see you next time.